Tom Brennan stood behind the counter of his small hardware store in Prescott, Arizona, watching the local news reporter set up her camera. He'd agreed to this interview against his better judgment, but the high school history teacher had been persistent. They wanted a veteran to talk to students about service and sacrifice. Tom was 71 years old, with white hair, a weathered face, and the kind of quiet demeanor that came from seeing too much and saying too little. He'd owned Brennan's Hardware for 20 years, and most people in Prescott knew him as a helpful, knowledgeable shopkeeper who could fix anything and never charged veterans for labor. What they didn't know, what Tom never talked about, was what he'd done before opening the hardware store. The reporter, Ashley Chen from the local ABC affiliate, smiled brightly as she positioned Tom near a display of American flags. "Mr. Brennan, thank you so much for doing this. Our Veterans Day special profiles local heroes. We're so grateful for your service." "Just did my job," Tom said quietly. "The history teacher mentioned you served in Vietnam. Can you tell us about that?" Tom hesitated. This was always the difficult part. "I was in Southeast Asia from 1968 to 1973, different assignments." "5 years, that's a long time. What unit were you with?" "MACVSOG, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group." Ashley's smile faltered slightly. She'd clearly never heard of it. "What did that unit do?" "Reconnaissance, behind enemy lines, classified operations." "Like Special Forces?" "We worked with Special Forces, yes." Ashley's producer, a young man in his 20s, spoke up. "Wait, you're saying you ran secret missions in Vietnam?" Tom heard the skepticism in his voice. "That's correct." "For 5 years?" "Yes." The producer and Ashley exchanged a glance. Tom recognized that look. He'd seen it before from people who thought his claims sounded too dramatic, too much like a movie. "Mr. Brennan," Ashley said carefully, "we'll need to verify your service record. You understand there have been cases of stolen valor, people claiming service they didn't perform." "I understand. My DD-214 is available." "Your DD-214 will show MACVSOG service." Tom knew what it would show. "It will show I served. The specific operations are still classified." The producer scoffed. "That's convenient. I did secret missions, but I can't prove it. That's what all the fakers say." Tom felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. Check my service record. But yes, most of what I did is still classified after 50 years. "That seems unlikely," the producer said. "Vietnam was decades ago. Why would anything still be classified?" "Because some operations crossed into Cambodia and Laos when Congress had forbidden it. Because some methods we used are still sensitive. Because some things the government did, they'd prefer stayed buried." Ashley was looking at Tom differently now, and he could see the calculation in her eyes. She smelled a story, but not the one she'd come for. "Mr. Brennan, we're going to need to do some research before we can air this. We'll be in touch." They packed up quickly and left. Tom stood alone in his store, knowing exactly what would happen next. They'd check his DD-214, find it vague on details, and decide he was either confused or lying. It had happened before. Tom's friend and fellow veteran, Jack Morrison, came in from the back office. Jack was 68, a former Marine who'd served in Vietnam as well. He'd overheard the whole interview. "You should have just told them you were a supply clerk or something simple," Jack said. "The truth always sounds too crazy." "Maybe I'm tired of hiding it." "Tom, you've been hiding it for 50 years. Why stop now?" Tom didn't have a good answer for that. Maybe he was just getting old and wanted someone to acknowledge what he'd done and seen. Maybe he was tired of the lies and omissions. Or maybe he was just tired. That evening, Tom sat in his small house on the edge of town, looking at the photos he kept in a locked drawer. There was one of him at 22, impossibly young, standing with his recon team in the jungle. They all looked hard and dangerous because they had been. Of the 6 men in that photo, only Tom had made it home. His phone rang. It was his daughter, Rebecca, calling from Portland. "Dad, I just got a weird call from a reporter asking about your military service. What's going on?" Tom sighed. "I did an interview for a Veterans Day story. I made the mistake of telling the truth." "What truth?" "About what I really did in Vietnam." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Dad, you never talk about Vietnam. What did you tell them? That I was MACVSOG, that I ran classified operations. Is that true? Yes. Why don't I know this? Why didn't you ever tell us? Because it was classified, because I couldn't, because even now most of it still is. Dad, this reporter was asking if you were legitimate. She implied you might be lying about your service. Tom felt a flash of anger, but he kept his voice calm. I'm not lying. Can you prove it? Not without violating classification protocols that are still in effect. Then how can you expect people to believe you? That was the question, wasn't it? How do you prove something when the proof is locked away in classified files? I don't expect people to believe me, Tom said. I never have. After the call, Tom poured himself a whiskey and sat on his back porch, looking at the Arizona desert stretching out under the stars. He'd survived the jungle, survived missions that should have killed him, survived losing every friend he'd made in Southeast Asia. But he wasn't sure he could survive being called a fraud. 2 days later, the story broke. Not the Veterans Day feature Ashley had been planning, but an investigation into Tom's claims. The headline on the local news website read, "Local hardware store owner's military claims questioned." The story was more balanced than it could have been, but the damage was in the questions it raised. Ashley had checked Tom's DD-214, which showed he'd served from 1968 to 1973 and received an honorable discharge. But it was vague on unit assignments and specific duties, listing only classified operations in several places. The story quoted a military records expert. While Mr. Brennan clearly served, the level of detail he's claiming about secret operations is impossible to verify. MACVSOG records are notoriously difficult to authenticate. Unfortunately, this is a common pattern with stolen valor cases, claims that sound impressive but can't be proven. The local VFW post commander was quoted. Tom Brennan has always been a valued member of our community and a regular at the VFW. However, some of his recent claims seem exaggerated. We hope he can provide documentation to support his statements. The story went semi-viral locally, shared across social media. The comment section was brutal. Another fake hero trying to get attention. Stolen valor is disgusting. This guy should be ashamed. I knew him in Vietnam and he was a cook. This secret mission stuff is BS. That last comment was a lie. Tom recognized the username as someone he'd never met. But it didn't matter. The narrative was set. Tom's store saw a drop in customers. People who'd been friendly for years now looked at him with suspicion. A note was taped to his door. Fraud. Jack Morrison came by the store every day, offering support. This will blow over, Tom, people forget. Maybe, but they never forget the accusation, just the truth. A week after the story broke, Tom received a call from a national news producer. They were working on a segment about stolen valor and wanted to interview him. I'm not a stolen valor case, Tom said. Then prove it, Mr. Brennan. Come on our show, bring your documentation, set the record straight. Tom knew it was a trap. They'd present him as another faker, use his vague DD-214 as evidence, and make an example of him. But refusing would look like he had something to hide. I'll think about it, Tom said. That evening, Rebecca called again. Dad, this is getting out of control. There are articles about you on military blogs. People are calling you a fraud. You have to do something. What would you have me do? Prove them wrong, show them your records. My records are classified. Then get them declassified. It doesn't work that way, honey. Make it work that way. Dad, your reputation is being destroyed. Our reputation. My kids are seeing articles calling their grandfather a liar. Tom felt the weight of that, his grandchildren reading that he was a fraud. I'm sorry, Rebecca, I never meant for this to affect you. Then fix it. After she hung up, Tom sat in silence for a long time. Then he made a decision. He went to his filing cabinet and pulled out a folder he'd kept for 50 years. Inside were documents he'd been given when he left the service, not official records, but contact information. Names and numbers for people who could verify what he'd done. Most of those people were probably dead by now. But maybe, just maybe, someone was still alive who could help. Tom picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 20 years. The phone rang 4 times, and Tom was about to hang up when a voice answered. Colonel Patterson. Tom's breath caught. Patterson was alive. Sir, this is Tom Brennan. I served under you in MACVSOG from 69 to 71. There was a pause. Brennan, I remember you, one of the best recon men I ever had. What's wrong? Sir, I'm being accused of stolen valor. I told the truth about my service, and now everyone thinks I'm a liar because I can't prove what I did. Patterson was quiet for a moment. Where are you? Prescott, Arizona. I'll make some calls. Hang tight, son, you're not going down like this. After the call, Tom felt a flicker of hope for the first time in a week. He didn't know it yet, but Patterson's calls would set off a chain reaction that would reach the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Because when you accused a MACVSOG veteran of fraud, you opened a door the government had been trying to keep closed for 50 years. And Tom Brennan was about to find out just how sensitive his service record really was. The national news segment aired 3 days later. Tom had declined to appear, which the host presented as evidence of guilt. Thomas Brennan claims to have run secret missions in Vietnam, the anchor said, her tone skeptical. But when we asked him to appear and provide proof, he refused. His DD-214 is vague and impossible to verify. This is a pattern we see repeatedly in stolen valor cases, dramatic claims with no evidence. They showed photos of Tom's hardware store, interviewed the local VFW commander who repeated his concerns, and brought on a military fraud expert who explained how people fabricate service records. The segment ended with the anchor's pointed question. Did Thomas Brennan serve his country, or is he serving himself with a fabricated story? The evidence suggests we may never know the truth. Tom watched it alone in his living room. He felt hollow inside, like everything he'd done and sacrificed had been erased. His phone exploded with messages. Most were angry, some were supportive, a few were death threats. The next morning, Tom arrived at his store to find graffiti spray-painted across the front. Liar and fake soldier. He was standing there looking at the damage when a police car pulled up. The officer who emerged was young, maybe 30, with a serious expression. Mr. Brennan, I'm Officer Martinez. We got a call about vandalism. Tom gestured to the graffiti. Someone expressed their opinion. Martinez took photos and wrote a report. For what it's worth, sir, my grandfather served in Vietnam. He told me about MACVSOG. Said they were the craziest, bravest men he ever met. If you were one of them, you have my respect. It was the first kind word Tom had heard in days. Thank you, officer. You going to press charges if we find who did this? Tom shook his head. No point, they're just angry. After Martinez left, Jack Morrison showed up with paint and supplies. Together, they covered the graffiti. They worked in silence, 2 old men reclaiming a small piece of dignity. You hear from Patterson? Jack asked. Not yet, probably realized it's not worth the effort. Give him time, things move slow in the government. But Tom's hope was fatting. He'd opened himself up, told the truth, and been destroyed for it. Maybe this was his punishment for surviving when his teammates hadn't. That afternoon, a car pulled up in front of the store. 2 men in suits emerged. They had that unmistakable federal agent look, serious, professional, alert. Tom's heart started pounding. This couldn't be good. The men entered the store and approached the counter. The older one, maybe 50, showed a badge. Mr. Brennan, I'm Agent David Marks, Department of Defense. This is Agent Chen. We need to speak with you privately. Tom led them to his office in the back. His hands were shaking slightly. What had he done wrong? Had he violated classification rules by even mentioning MACVSOG? Mr. Brennan, Marks said, we understand you've recently made public claims about serving with MACVSOG in Vietnam. I did serve with them. That's not a claim, it's a fact. We're not disputing that, but your statements have created a problem. What kind of problem? The kind that involves classified operations that are still sensitive 50 years later. We need you to stop talking about your service. Tom felt anger rising. People think I'm a fraud, my reputation is destroyed, and you're telling me to stay silent. For national security purposes, yes. That's not fair. Agent Chen spoke for the first time. Life isn't fair, Mr. Brennan. You signed agreements when you left the service. Those agreements are still in effect. So I'm supposed to just let everyone think I'm a liar. Yes, Mark said bluntly. That's exactly what we're asking. Tom stood up. Get out of my store. The agents exchanged glances. Mr. Brennan. I said get out. I've spent 50 years keeping secrets. I've stayed quiet while people who never served a day made judgments about me. I'm done. If you want to charge me with something, charge me. Otherwise, leave. Marks handed Tom a business card. If you continue making public statements, there will be consequences. Legal consequences. Think about that. After they left, Tom sat in his office, the card burning a hole in his pocket. The government was threatening him to protect their secrets. Secrets about operations that had cost him everything, his friends, his peace of mind, pieces of his soul. And he was supposed to just accept being called a fraud to protect those secrets. Jack came into the office. Who were those guys? DOD. They want me to shut up about MACVSOG. You going too? Tom looked at his old friend. I don't know anymore. What's the point of protecting secrets when the price is your honor? That evening, Tom received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Patterson, the man he'd called for help, appeared at his door. Patterson was in his 80s now, but still carried himself with military bearing. Tom, it's good to see you. They shook hands, and Tom invited him in. I got a call today, Patterson said once they were seated. From some very unhappy people in Washington. They told me to tell you to keep quiet. Did they threaten you too? They tried. I told them to go to hell. Patterson smiled. The advantage of being 83 is you stop caring what people think. I'm being called a fraud, Colonel. My family is being harassed, and the government wants me to just take it. I know, that's why I'm here. Patterson pulled out a folder. I've spent the last week making calls, pulling in favors from people I served with. I've been putting together documentation. What kind of documentation? The kind that proves you're telling the truth. Declassified after-action reports that mention your name. Testimony from other MACVSOG veterans who served with you. Medal citations. Tom's breath caught. Medal citations. You earned a Silver Star on Operation Prairie Fire in 1970. You never knew because it was classified, along with 2 Bronze Stars and 3 Purple Hearts, all buried in classified files because the operations were never supposed to exist. Tom felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. I never knew. That's how they wanted it. Keep everything secret. Keep everyone quiet. But Tom, you shouldn't have to live as a fraud when you're a hero. The DOD told me there would be consequences if I kept talking. Patterson's expression hardened. Then let them try. I've contacted a lawyer who specializes in classification issues. We're going to petition to have your records declassified, all of them. Can we do that? We can try, and Tom, you're not alone in this. There are dozens of MACVSOG veterans who are tired of being erased from history. Some of them are joining this fight. Over the next week, things moved quickly. Patterson's lawyer filed a formal request with the Department of Defense to declassify Tom's service records. The request was denied, but the lawyer had expected that. He immediately filed an appeal. Meanwhile, Patterson had contacted other MACVSOG veterans. Men who'd run the same kinds of missions, who'd lived in the same shadows, who were tired of their service being invisible. They started coming forward publicly, supporting Tom's claims. These were men with verified records, men who couldn't be easily dismissed as frauds. The story evolved. What had been local man's questionable claims became secret Vietnam unit emerges from shadows to defend accused veteran. Ashley Chen, the reporter who'd started this, did a follow-up story. This time, she interviewed 3 MACVSOG veterans who all verified that Tom Brennan had served with distinction. Tom was one of the best, said Master Sergeant Rhett, James Walsh, who'd run missions with Tom. He saved my life twice, called him Brennan the Ghost because he could move through the jungle like he was invisible. Anyone calling him a fraud doesn't know what they're talking about. The tone was shifting, but Tom was still being called a liar by many. The national news had done their hit piece, and most people remembered the accusation better than any defense. Then, 3 weeks after Patterson's first visit, something unexpected happened. A sealed envelope arrived at Tom's store via courier. It was marked, classified, and addressed to Thomas J. Brennan. Tom opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter on Department of Defense letterhead. Mr. Brennan asterisk. Due to recent public interest, and after extensive review, the Department of Defense has agreed to partially declassify certain records related to your service in MACVSOG. Attached you will find documentation of your assignments, operations, and commendations. Please note that many operational details remain classified for national security purposes. However, the attached records should be sufficient to verify your service and address recent public questions about your credibility. The DoD apologizes for any difficulties caused by the extended classification of these records. Tom read the letter 3 times, then he looked at the documents attached. There were mission reports with his name, commendation citations, operation summaries, and yes, the medal citations Patterson had mentioned, a silver star, 2 bronze stars, 3 purple hearts. All classified for 50 years. All now declassified because Tom had refused to accept being called a fraud. Tom called Patterson immediately. "Did you do this?" "Not me," Patterson said. "This came from higher up. Someone in DoD decided it was better to declassify your records than face the legal fight we were preparing. Congratulations, Tom. You're no longer a secret." That evening, Tom held a press conference in his hardware store. The same reporters who'd called him a fraud crowded into the space, cameras rolling. Tom laid out the newly declassified documents on the counter. 3 weeks ago, I was called a liar and a fraud for telling the truth about my service. Today, the Department of Defense has declassified records proving everything I said. I served in MACVSOG from 1968 to 1973. I ran classified operations behind enemy lines in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and I earned decorations that I never knew about because they were too secret to tell me. He looked directly at Ashley Chen. "I understand why you question me. My claims sounded impossible, but sometimes the truth sounds impossible. Sometimes the things our government asks people to do are so sensitive that even the people who do them can't talk about it for 50 years. Tom held up one of the documents. "This is an after-action report from Operation Prairie Fire in 1970. My team of 6 men went 40 miles into Laos to gather intelligence on North Vietnamese supply routes. We were discovered, ambushed, and fought our way out over 3 days. Only 2 of us survived. I was recommended for the Silver Star. I never knew until this week." The room was silent. "I don't blame people for doubting me," Tom continued. "How could you believe something like that without proof? But I'm standing here today to say, be careful before you call someone a fraud. Be careful before you destroy someone's reputation. Because sometimes the people who sound too heroic to be believed are exactly as heroic as they claim." The press conference ended. The reporters rushed to file their stories. But Tom's journey wasn't over yet. The real revelations were still to come. The story exploded nationally. "Accused fraud was decorated war hero all along," became the new headline. Tom's partially declassified records were verified by multiple military historians and Vietnam War experts. The narrative flipped completely. Tom went from fraud to hero overnight. The same outlets that had questioned him now praised him. The same social media commenters who'd called him a liar now offered apologies. Tom found it all exhausting and slightly surreal. But the declassification had consequences nobody anticipated. 2 days after Tom's press conference, a Pentagon spokesperson gave a brief statement. The declassification of Mr. Brennan's records was an exception made due to unique circumstances. It does not represent a change in policy regarding MACVSOG operations, which remain classified for national security reasons. But that statement only raised more questions. News organizations started digging into MACVSOG history. Other veterans who'd served in the unit started coming forward, emboldened by Tom's example. Within a week, there were calls from Congress for a full declassification of MACVSOG records. Senator Patricia Morrison from Arizona led the charge. She invited Tom to Washington to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. "Mr. Brennan," she said when they met, "you've opened a door the Pentagon wanted to keep closed. There are hundreds of MACVSOG veterans whose service has been erased from history. They deserve recognition." Tom sat in the hearing room, facing a panel of senators and a gallery full of cameras. He'd never wanted this level of attention, but here he was. Senator Morrison began the questioning. Mr. Brennan, can you explain to this committee why your service records were classified for over 50 years? Tom chose his words carefully. Senator, MACVSOG conducted operations that Congress hadn't authorized. We crossed borders we weren't supposed to cross. We did things the American public wasn't supposed to know about. The government classified our records to protect itself from political consequences. Are you saying the government lied about these operations? I'm saying the government kept them secret. There's a difference. Another senator, Richard Blake from Texas, spoke up. Mr. Brennan, some have suggested that MACVSOG committed war crimes, that the secrecy was to hide illegal activities. How do you respond? Tom felt anger flash through him. Senator, we operated under the laws of war and followed the Geneva Conventions to the extent possible in an unconventional conflict. Were mistakes made? I'm sure they were. War is ugly and imperfect. But the men I served with were honorable soldiers doing an impossible job. Can you give us specifics about your operations? Senator, even with partial declassification, many details remain classified. I can tell you we gathered intelligence on enemy movements, disrupted supply lines, and rescued downed American pilots. I can tell you we operated in small teams, often outnumbered 100 to 1. And I can tell you that of the 6 men in my recon team, only I survived to come home. The hearing room was silent. Senator Morrison spoke gently. Mr. Brennan, you mentioned earning medals you never knew about. Can you explain that? Yes, ma'am. I was awarded a Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts for actions in classified operations. Because the operations were secret, the medals were classified too. I served for 5 years, was wounded multiple times, lost all my closest friends, and came home to nothing. No recognition, no acknowledgement, just orders to never talk about what I'd done. How did that affect you? Tom paused, feeling emotion rise in his throat. I came home from the war and couldn't tell anyone what I'd experienced. I couldn't mourn my friends publicly because officially they'd died in training accidents or other cover stories. I couldn't seek help for trauma because explaining the trauma would violate classification. For 50 years, I've carried the weight of those missions alone. He looked directly at the committee. And then when I finally told the truth, I was called a fraud. That hurt worse than anything I experienced in the jungle, because at least in the jungle I knew who the enemy was. The hearing continued for 3 hours. Tom answered questions about operations, about the need for continued classification, about the toll secrecy had taken on MACVSOG veterans. At the end, Senator Morrison made an announcement. This committee will be recommending a comprehensive review of classified Vietnam-era records, with a goal of declassifying information that no longer poses a national security risk. The men and women who served in programs like MACVSOG deserve to have their service acknowledged. After the hearing, Tom was surrounded by reporters, but he was also approached by other veterans, men who'd served in MACVSOG and other classified programs. An older man, maybe 75, shook Tom's hand with tears in his eyes. Thank you for speaking up. I served in SOG from 67 to 69. Lost my whole team in Laos. Never could talk about it. My own kids don't know what I did. Another veteran said, I was accused of lying too about 10 years ago. Nobody believed I'd done the things I'd done. I gave up trying to explain, but you fought back. You made them listen. Tom realized that this had become bigger than just his reputation. He'd become a symbol for all the secret warriors whose service had been erased for political convenience. That evening, Tom appeared on a national news program. The host, who'd been skeptical 3 weeks earlier, was now apologetic. Mr. Brennan, I want to start by apologizing. We questioned your credibility without fully investigating. That was wrong. You were doing your job, Tom said. Questioning claims that couldn't be proven, I don't fault you for that. But the claims were true. Yes, but how were you supposed to know? The government had buried the evidence for 50 years. The interview continued, with Tom explaining MACVSOG's mission and the toll of secrecy. Millions of people watched, many learning for the first time about this shadow war within the Vietnam War. When Tom returned to Prescott, he found his hardware store filled with flowers, letters, and gifts. The graffiti that had called him a liar had been covered with a mural painted by local veterans, an American flag with "Thank you, Tom" written below. The community that had doubted him now embraced him. The VFW post commander who'd questioned his claims publicly apologized and asked Tom to become the post's historian. Tom accepted with grace, though privately he still felt the sting of how quickly people had turned against him. 2 months after the Senate hearing, Tom received another official letter. This one was an invitation to the White House. The president was holding a ceremony to honor Vietnam veterans whose service had been classified. 30 MACVSOG veterans would receive their medals in a public ceremony, including Tom. Rebecca flew in from Portland to attend with Tom. On the flight to Washington, she held her father's hand. "Dad, I'm sorry I doubted you. I should have trusted you." "You couldn't have known, honey. The evidence suggested I was lying." "But you're my father. I should have known you better than that." Tom squeezed her hand. "You know me now, that's what matters." The White House ceremony was surreal. Tom stood in the East Room with 29 other veterans, most of them in their 70s, all of them receiving recognition 50 years late. The president spoke about sacrifice and secrecy, about the debt owed to soldiers who couldn't talk about their service. "These men performed some of the most dangerous missions in American military history," the president said. "They operated behind enemy lines, often outnumbered, always at risk. And when they came home, they couldn't tell anyone what they'd done. They carried their scars in silence, their valor unrecognized, their sacrifice invisible." The president pinned the silver star on Tom's chest. "For extraordinary gallantry in action against an armed enemy in Laos, April 1970. Sergeant Thomas Brennan led his team through 3 days of continuous enemy contact, ensuring the survival of wounded teammates and the successful extraction of vital intelligence. His actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service." Tom stood at attention, feeling the weight of the medal. He thought about his team, about the men who didn't come home. This medal was as much theirs as his. After the ceremony, Tom was approached by a woman in her 60s. She had tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Brennan, my father was in MACVSOG, Lieutenant David Chen. He died in Laos in 1971. We were told it was a training accident. We never knew the truth until your story broke." Tom felt a jolt of recognition. "Chen, I knew your father. He was a good officer, a good man. Can you tell me what really happened to him?" Tom looked at her tear-stained face, this daughter who'd never known the truth about her father's death, and he made a decision. "Yes, I'll tell you everything I can." They sat in a quiet corner of the White House, and Tom told her about her father's final mission, about his bravery, about how he died saving his team, about the memorial Tom and others had held in the jungle, even though officially it never happened. "Thank you," she said when he finished. "Thank you for telling me. For 50 years I thought he died in some pointless accident. Now I know he died a hero." Tom realized that this was the real power of declassification. Not the medals or the recognition, but the truth finally reaching the people who needed to hear it. Over the next several months, the DoD continued to declassify MACVSOG records. Families learned the truth about how their loved ones had died. Veterans finally received the recognition they'd earned. History was rewritten to include a war that had been hidden within a war. And Tom Brennan, the hardware store owner who'd been called a fraud, became the face of that revelation. But the story still had one more chapter. One more secret that would finally come to light. 6 months after the White House ceremony, Tom received a package from the Department of Defense. It was marked with multiple classification stamps and required a signature to accept. Inside was a letter and a thick folder of documents. The letter read, "Mr. Brennan asterisk. Following the partial declassification of MACVSOG records, the DoD has conducted a comprehensive review of remaining classified materials. We have identified documents relevant to your service that can now be declassified without compromising national security. The attached materials include complete records of your operations from 1968-1973. Also included are materials related to Operation Nighthawk, November 1971, which you may not be aware of. Please contact the undersigned if you have questions about these materials." Tom's hands shook as he opened the folder. Most of it was mission reports and operational summaries he'd expected. But the Operation Nighthawk materials were marked Top Secret EYES only, with declassification stamps dated just last month. He began reading. Operation Nighthawk had been a mission to rescue a high-value prisoner from a North Vietnamese prison camp in Laos. The prisoner was a CIA officer who'd been captured with intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations. Tom had led the rescue team. They'd gone in at night, fought through heavy resistance, and extracted the prisoner along with 3 American POWs who'd been held in the same facility. Tom remembered the operation. It had been one of his most difficult missions. But what he didn't know, what the newly declassified documents revealed, was who the CIA officer was. Edward Morrison, who would later become director of the CIA. And one of the POWs rescued that night was Air Force Captain James Patterson, who would later become a U.S. Senator. Tom sat back in his chair, stunned. He'd saved the lives of 2 men who went on to hold some of the highest positions in American government, and he'd never known. The documents included letters both men had written years later when they'd risen to positions of authority. Both had tried to get Tom's records declassified. Both had been blocked by the same secrecy they'd once been protected by. Morrison had written in 1985, "Sergeant Brennan saved my life and the lives of 3 other Americans at great personal risk. He deserves recognition for his valor. However, I understand the political sensitivity of Operation Nighthawk and accept that classification must continue." Patterson had written in 1998, "Tom Brennan is one of the bravest men I've ever known. He led the team that rescued me from a hell I can't fully describe. I owe him my life. If there's ever an opportunity to honor him publicly, I strongly support it." Tom felt tears on his cheeks. These men had tried to honor him. They'd been blocked by the same secrecy that had protected their own careers. He called Colonel Patterson, who was still alive and still Tom's strongest supporter. "Did you know," Tom asked, "that you were one of the POWs I pulled out in '71? "I knew," Patterson said quietly. "I've known since the day you rescued me. I tried to get you recognized, Tom, tried for years, but the operation was too sensitive. Morrison and I both pushed, but we kept getting shut down." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you were living a quiet life. You'd found peace. I didn't want to drag you back into that world, and honestly, I didn't think the records would ever be declassified." Tom absorbed that. "Patterson, why did you really help me when this all started? Was it guilt?" "It was debt. You saved my life. When I heard you were being called a fraud, I couldn't let that stand, not when I knew the truth." After the call, Tom read through the rest of the documents. There were commendations from senior officers, intelligence assessments of missions he'd run, and casualty reports for his fallen teammates. One document stopped him cold. It was a psychiatric evaluation from 1973 when Tom had been preparing to leave the service. "Sergeant Brennan shows signs of significant trauma," the evaluation read. "He has survived experiences that would break most men. He has lost every member of his team and carries survivor's guilt. However, due to classification requirements, he cannot discuss these experiences with civilian mental health providers. Recommend extended debriefing and counseling within secure military facilities." Tom didn't remember any such counseling. He'd been given a handshake, told never to talk about his service, and sent back to civilian life to figure out his trauma alone. He felt anger rising. The government had known he was damaged. They'd known he needed help. But helping him would have required acknowledging what he'd done, which was too politically sensitive. So they'd sent him home to suffer in silence. Tom made copies of all the documents and sent them to Senator Morrison, who'd led the push for declassification. He included a note. "These are the real costs of secrecy. Not just hidden medals, but hidden trauma. How many other veterans were damaged by what they saw and couldn't talk about?" Morrison called him personally. "Tom, I'm appalled. The evaluation shows they knew you needed help and didn't provide it. That's unconscionable. What can be done about it now?" "I'm introducing legislation to provide counseling and medical support to all veterans of classified programs. 50 years late, but better than never. Would you be willing to testify again?" "Yes, ma'am, if it helps others." The second round of hearings focused on the long-term effects of classification on veterans' mental health. Tom and other MACVSOG veterans testified about decades of untreated trauma, about carrying secrets that isolated them from family and friends, about the toll of invisible wounds. The legislation passed unanimously. The Classified Service Veterans Support Act provided free mental health care to any veteran who'd served in classified operations and couldn't seek help due to secrecy restrictions. It was a small victory, but meaningful. Tom's story became a book, written with the help of a military historian. Ghost Warrior, a MACVSOG veteran's journey from secret hero to accused fraud and back, became a bestseller. The proceeds went to a charity Tom established to support veterans of classified operations. A year after he'd been called a fraud, Tom stood in his hardware store surrounded by photos from his journey. The White House ceremony, the Senate hearings, the medal ceremonies where other MACVSOG veterans finally received their decorations. Ashley Chen, the reporter who'd first questioned his claims, came by for a follow-up interview. "Mr. Brennan, looking back, do you regret telling the truth about your service? If you'd stayed quiet, you could have avoided all the accusations." Tom thought about it. "I regret the pain it caused my family. I regret that people doubted me. But no, I don't regret the truth coming out, because it wasn't just my truth. It was the truth for hundreds of veterans whose service had been erased. They deserved to be acknowledged." What do you want people to learn from your story? Two things. First, don't be quick to call someone a liar just because their story sounds impossible. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. Second, the government shouldn't be able to hide the truth forever just because it's politically inconvenient. Secrecy has a cost, and that cost is usually paid by the people who deserve it least. After the interview, Tom's phone rang. It was Edward Morrison, the former CIA director he'd rescued in 1971. "Tom, I wanted to call personally. I've been following your story. I'm ashamed it took 50 years for the truth to come out." "You tried to help, sir. That's in the documents." "Not hard enough. I let bureaucracy and politics get in the way of doing what was right. I'm sorry." "I appreciate that, sir." "There's something else. I've been working with Senator Patterson. We want to nominate you for the Medal of Honor for Operation Nighthawk. The declassified records show you met all the criteria. It should have been awarded in 1971. Tom felt his breath catch. The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration. "Sir, I don't need." "This isn't about what you need, Tom. It's about what you earned. Will you accept the nomination?" Tom thought about his team, about the men who hadn't come home. "Only if the men I lost are honored too." "We'll make sure they are." The Medal of Honor ceremony took place 18 months after Tom had first been called a fraud. He stood in the White House again, but this time receiving the nation's highest honor. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Sergeant Thomas J. Brennan distinguished himself by exceptionally valorous actions during Operation Nighthawk, November 1971, while serving as team leader of a rescue mission deep in enemy-held territory." It detailed how Tom had led his team through overwhelming enemy forces, personally engaged and neutralized multiple threats, carried a wounded teammate while under fire, and ensured the successful extraction of 4 American prisoners. Tom's children and grandchildren attended. So did the families of his fallen teammates who were posthumously recognized. So did dozens of MACVSOG veterans, men who'd served in the shadows and were finally stepping into the light. And standing in the front row were Edward Morrison and James Patterson, the men whose lives Tom had saved 50 years earlier. After the ceremony, Tom stood before the press one final time. "This medal doesn't belong to me alone," he said. "It belongs to every member of MACVSOG who served in secret. It belongs to my team, especially the men who didn't come home. And it belongs to everyone who serves in classified operations and can't talk about what they've done." He looked directly at the cameras. "A year and a half ago, reporters called me a fraud. They had reason to doubt. My claims sounded impossible and I couldn't prove them. I don't blame them for their skepticism. But I hope this serves as a lesson. Sometimes the impossible is true. Sometimes the people who sound too heroic to believe really are heroes. And sometimes," Tom continued, "the only fraud is the secrecy itself. The lie that says some truths are too dangerous to tell. The pretense that we can erase people's service and sacrifice for political convenience." He touched the medal on his chest. "This is recognition I never expected, but the real honor was the chance to serve, to work with brave men who gave everything, to do something that mattered even if nobody knew about it. The reporters called me a fraud. Then my name appeared in classified files, and the truth came out. But the truth was always there. We just needed the courage to acknowledge it. Tom returned to Prescott a genuine American hero. His hardware store became a destination for veterans and history enthusiasts. He gave talks at schools and military bases, always emphasizing the same themes: service, sacrifice, and truth. But his favorite moments were the quiet ones, when a veteran of a classified operation would come to the store and quietly thank him for making it possible to talk about their service. When a family member would show him a declassified record about a loved one and say, "Finally, I know the truth." 3 years after being called a fraud, Tom sat on his back porch watching the Arizona sunset. His Medal of Honor hung in a display case in his living room, alongside the Silver Star and Bronze Stars he'd earned 50 years earlier. Rebecca visited from Portland with his grandchildren. They asked him about the war, about MACVSOG, about being a secret soldier. And for the first time in 50 years, Tom could answer honestly. "It was the hardest thing I ever did," he told them. "I lost friends, I saw terrible things, I carried secrets that weighed on me for decades, but I also served with the bravest men I've ever known. We did things that mattered, even if we couldn't talk about them." His grandson, 14 years old, asked, "Were you scared?" "Terrified almost every mission, but we did it anyway because it was our job." "Are you glad you finally told the truth?" Tom thought about everything that had happened: the accusations, the vindication, the declassification, the recognition. "Yes," he said, "because the truth matters, even when it's painful, even when it takes 50 years, the truth always matters." Later that evening, Tom sat alone on his porch, looking at the stars. He thought about his team, about the young men who died in jungles half a world away. He'd survived, he'd been called a fraud, he'd fought back, and finally, the truth had emerged from classified files and government secrecy. The reporters had called him a fraud, but his name had appeared in classified files, and the truth had set him free. Tom raised a glass to the night sky, to his fallen brothers, to everyone who'd served in shadows and silence. "We're not secrets anymore," he whispered. And somewhere in the darkness, he felt like they heard him. The mission, after 50 years, was finally complete. The truth had come home, just like Tom always had. Against all odds, through all the secrets, all the way home.